Somehow my work is also placed, which I guess is why it was clustered like this, near Tanguy and Cloes. So broadly, I'm working on the provision of housing that meets human needs, but within planetary boundaries, and looking at the role of circular economy in providing this housing. So this is kind of the large-scale theme of my topic. I'm in the HERUS lab, so I didn't write it. Human Environment Relations in Urban Systems, and I'm supervised by Professor Claudia Binder, and I studied at Anastasiades. But today I'm going to focus in on one part of the research, and I'm going to propose a methodological framework that I've been working on developing. I don't really have many results to show. It's more to enable a discussion on this methodology. So, circular economy for cities, how can we extend the lifespan of buildings? So the starting point of my research has been to try and understand, firstly, what creates decent housing, stemming very simplistically at the moment from the United Nations Charter on the Right to Adequate Housing, which states that decent housing is housing that provides security of tenure, that provides access to the services necessary to people, that is affordable in the sense that it doesn't take away from people's ability to meet their other needs. It's habitable, the location is allowing them to access the services, like social services that they need, and that is culturally adequate, so it's respectful of the people who are living in it culturally. And so decent housing, I think we can all agree, is a core sustainable development goal and a fundamental human right. However, the provision of this housing comes with a number of challenges, primarily material challenges, also energy challenges, but I'm focusing on material challenges. So the construction sector itself is a huge user of resources. This means mining of resources. As you can see in the graph, the top line is the resource consumption or resource mining of sand, gravel, rock, which is primarily used for concrete and other building materials. And with it comes a whole bunch of environmental impacts, such as loss of biodiversity, habitat alteration, CO2 emissions, perhaps the primary one. And this is only stated to grow. So as we build in new cities around the world, there's really this question of how do we make sure that these resources that we're putting into place aren't or are sort of useful from the sense that we are creating these environmental impacts. How can we not lock ourselves into new resource dependencies? On top of this, more specifically, residential buildings are a really large user of energy, mostly through heating. So that's space heating and, well, mostly through space heating. And the actual process of construction, demolition, and operation, so sort of the life cycle of the built environment, creates a lot of waste, either during construction, during operations, or at the end of the lifetime of a building, so during demolition. And this waste accounts for almost a quarter to a third of all the waste that's created in terms of volume in Europe. And it ends up in a few places. Some of it is recycled into aggregates or into new materials for buildings. Some of it, actually most of it, gets used as backfilling. So that's using material to fill in quarries or under streets, for example. And so clearly there's a need to rethink the management of resources as we're facing issues of climate change stemming from this enormous emission of greenhouse gas emissions, as well as the other environmental impacts that the buildings are creating. One of the strategies that have been put forward to reduce our impact on the environment is circular economy. So this was sort of the starting point of my research. Circular economy puts itself forward as a new paradigm in which the environment is specifically taken into account in understanding of the economy. And so it acknowledges the role of the environment, but also the interaction between society, the sort of technosphere, and society, the environment, and the technosphere. Maybe more sort of pragmatically, what it puts forward is that a circular economy, in order to design one, it must be restorative by design, and it aims to keep products, components, materials at their highest utility and value at all times. in order to decrease the amount of waste that's created, but also decrease the amount of new resources that we need. It's a nebulous concept. It's been defined in many different ways over time, and it's been put into action also in many different ways. I won't go into this detail at the moment, but one sort of largely understood idea of circular economy is that there's this idea of moving from the linear economy in which we take materials, we use them, and then we dispose of them, either through incineration or landfills, and to go towards recovering those materials, recycling them, or as we go upwards towards more circularity, refusing the use of materials for other ideas, or rethinking and reducing what we use. When it comes to products or goods, somehow we can get an understanding of how to put these strategies into practice. So refusing the use of a disposable water bottle for the sake of using your reusable one, or repairing your pair of jeans many times instead of just wearing it and as soon as there's a rip, you throw it away. So for products and for goods, for industrial items, which is also where this concept has mostly been developed, it sort of makes sense. But when you go into buildings, we reach a whole bunch of new questions. How do you actually understand what refusing, rethinking, reducing means for buildings? And in my case, specifically for housing. Oh, time is going fast. Okay. So there's sort of there is quite some research that's being done on the recycling, recovering perspectives of circular economy in buildings. So they focused on either components, which is sort of in the middle of the circle, or more largely on cities. So how you can facilitate material exchange between different areas. But there's relatively little research that focuses on the building as a product or object that can become a part of circularity. And so my first kind of part of my research considered how literature on circular economy in cities understands what the objective of circular economy is, what the understanding of lifespan and waste is, how you should define scales and boundaries, and how do you assess whether you're actually making something more circular. I'm not going to go into all of this. I'm just going to talk about the lifespan part for a few minutes. And so this was based on a thematic analysis of a number of publications. I'm going to put forward now what the 6 main themes that I saw in the literature were on understanding what creates or how you understand and define the lifespan of a building. The first was its functional lifespan. So sort of the understanding that a building is or exists or is useful for as long as it has utility, so it can be used for its original function. The second was the economic lifespan. So a building can be maintained in the circular economy, and this understanding of circular economy, for as long as it contains or retains financial value and has a return on investment that allows it to continue being used. The third, the technical lifespan. So for as long as the structure and the actual materials, the technical elements of the building are continuing to last, for that's the lifespan of a building. Fourth, this was slightly less relevant to buildings, but did come up, the energetic or nutrient value. Energetic mostly meaning that for as long as you can take apart the components of a building and either incinerate it or something else to create energy, it still maintains use. So it's material until all the energy has been used from the materials that make the building. Fifth, the cultural lifespan. So for as long as the building retains cultural significance, whether it's dependent on intrinsic values, on natural values, on historical or artistic values, for as long as it retains cultural significance, the lifespan of a building continues. And finally, communal values. So the understanding of a building more from the sense that it holds a value that cannot be exchanged for money. So either collective ownership or cooperatives that maintain and recover a building in certain ways. And so translating this into when does the end of life of a building happen? When does a building actually become obsolete and no longer a part of the circular economy? Can be understood from a number of ways. One of the concepts that was put forward that I was also drawing from was from Thompson and van der Vlier in 2011. where they considered that the building is useful on a number of axes. So it becomes obsolete endogenously versus exogenously, so either from the building itself or its location, and it's physical and behavioral and how it's used. So the physical being the actual materials and the behavior being how it's being used. I'm going to wrap up in like a few seconds. And so the concepts that I mentioned before also show that this understanding of obsolescence can be expanded way further than this when we consider this circular economy concept as well. We can understand better that whereas the technical and economic lifespan have sort of been assumed in this understanding of obsolescence, maybe the biochemical or the communal aspects have not. I had a couple more slides, but I think I'll kind of wrap up here, basically to say I was trying to expand the understanding of what makes a building obsolete with the larger aim of understanding why we demolish or continue to use certain buildings and what we can learn from that for the circular economy. I'm very open to questions, and also I'll just put up 2 discussion questions up here in case you want to give me answers.
I don't know if anybody wants to start. Thank you. Thanks, Ankita, for the presentation. There were a few small things that I didn't fully understand, so I wanted to just quickly get on those. When you talked about circular economy at different scales and how there's a lot going on specific building parts and on the scale of cities, but not on the scale of buildings. Maybe you can just explain.
Yeah,
meaning that you know, how would a building as a whole fit into the circular economy notion as opposed to building parts that are being used?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll just bring us back to over here. So when I was saying that building components have some research being done in terms of circular economy, it came from the idea that when we talk about recovering, recycling, repurposing, remanufacturing, it's much easier to understand this from the perspective of the components of a building. So how can this concrete pillar, when this building is going to be demolished, removed and reused in a different area? And so this understanding of circularity, I think, is quite prevalent for the built environment as well, because it's maybe because it's a little bit easier to work with. But when we want to step back and say, okay, does this building need to be demolished? Why? Who is deciding that and for what reason? Like, is it because it's lost economic value? Is it because the location is now not right for it? Like, what are these understandings of the building as itself, as it's being used? This has received a little bit less attention, and it's also kind of the gap in which my research fits. And then to like kind of expand onto the city part, just to go through all the scales, on a city level, it's somehow easier to understand that stocks and flows of material can move from one area to another. So whether we talk about these pillars, for example, which you can't, this is another issue of circular economy, like, yes, we want to reuse, recycle, remanufacture like objects and material, but it doesn't mean that it matches with when we actually demand them, right? Just because we want to recycle this concrete pillar doesn't mean that somewhere we actually need this concrete pillar right now. And so on a city level, there's been some research done into how to work with like material exchange programs or more the logistic aspects, like reverse logistics, supply chain issues, as an understanding of the materials and how they move through a city. But the building itself, this receives a bit less.
Yeah, thanks. I guess in that context, what I'm wondering is when you talk about the obsolescence of a building, or when does a building become obsolete and then we move towards demolishing it. When you look at that, where does, say, where do processes of adjusting building, rehabilitation, reworking, basically changing their purpose, etc., where do they fit in? Because in a way, it's not just about, does it work as it does? No, we demolish it. there's a whole lot of in between of how much can you improve, change, adjust, and yeah, how big that effort is, etc.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. I can't answer the question in the sense of how big that space is or what it means, but I can point to a difficulty in working with circular economy for the built environment. So we collect data. So we collect data on construction of new housing. We have some data on demolition, and we don't really know what happens in the operations of a building from a material perspective. So this renovation, refurbishment, repairing, just people doing what they want within their house in general, we don't have an insight into this. And so we also don't know what the material stocks and flows are outside of the blueprints that we had from when the building was created. In order to try and give some contribution to this aspect, some of my work will be focused on using survey and interview data of households to understand what repair renovation work they've done in their houses. We're focusing specifically on thermal renovation, also would be just because asking them for all renovation is kind of becoming too big of a task, although I would have loved to do it. But really focusing on what insulation changes, thermal in terms of like windows or any other wall work has been done, to also get an insight into what the material flows related to this are in the existing building stock. It's a huge question. It's not something like we can understand, like we could say that, say once every 10 years people renovate their house, and then we could work from that. But I'm guessing, we will find out that the reality is quite different. Maybe I can add one more thing. A lot of this also is related to who and where this built environment is, right? I didn't go into it here, but I'm working on Geneva and on Switzerland in general. But in Geneva, most of the housing is rented. And what this means is that you might have lived in your rental house for 20 years, and you may or may not have any incentive to actually do the renovation that's necessary to make a housing, like, as we talked about, like to make it have this environmental performance. You might just make changes for everyday comfort because it's not, maybe because it's not your house. And in trying to understand how people actually, like these dynamics, this is also part of the survey and interview work.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ankita. That's a fascinating topic. For your theoretical framework, I'm thinking maybe looking at some historical case studies, like for instance, the classic example of rubble after the Second World War and how rubble has been recycled and used in construction in many cities around Europe. So there's a vast literature there which can inspire this kind of thinking. Then on the concept of obsolescence, obviously, Daniel Abramson work on obsolescence. Maybe you know this work. And again, kind of history-inspired examples. But equally, I was thinking maybe some contrasting examples. Buildings which we cannot demolish, yeah, like the bunkers in Vienna from the time of Hitler, and this has been a huge problem in Vienna because we cannot remove them, we cannot demolish them, and there are equally a lot of interesting studies, anthropological and historical.
Could you explain why? I'm sorry, I'm not familiar. Sorry? Could you explain why they can't be demolished? I'm not familiar with it.
Because they can, because of the concrete structure. Yeah, and also because they are central places in the city. The studies of Melanie van der Hoen, who used this expression of she looks at the buildings as eyesores, and she looks also at different attempts of actually refurbishing, transforming, rethinking, recycling, all the re you had in the diagram, which is amazing. So all the terms were rethinking, reusing, recycling. And she actually shows the impossibility to perform any rework, rethinking and refurbishing. Some slight changes are possible, but these eyesores still remain there in Vienna, in central parts of the city, and reminds us of this history. What if we cannot get rid of a building? What if there are also buildings that cannot die and we cannot demolish? So extreme cases like this could also inspire your methodology, kind of different thinking about the theoretical framework, and equally can inform a different type of inquiry, which you have already started doing, I think, in an interesting way. Then I was also thinking about this literature, The Building Must Die, and all this kind mainly as a kind of dialogue with the work of Brandt and how buildings learn, right? Because your work is also inspired, I think, without mentioning it, but I think it's quite inspired by this work in the 90s of Brandt, but also most recent work of Jane Jacobs and Stephen Cairns, Buildings Must Die, reflecting again on the basis of historical, but also philosophical cases on this kind of cyclic nature of buildings and the trajectory of buildings, the social life of buildings, which you also question in an interesting way. Yeah, what is it that we can recycle, mobilize, and rethink in the life cycle of building, and what cannot be done? Although we are all tempted, I think, to think more in the terms of circular economy, yeah? This linear way of thinking, it's not that much embedded in the contemporary thinking about architecture any longer. So it's a very timely topic, but also I think maybe we'll need a little bit of more texture in terms of understanding the different meanings of the in the cycle, and also understanding the contextual specificity of the cases. If we're dealing with contemporary cases in particular, is there any case that is not based on a certain process of recycling and rethinking? So anything that we built from scratch on a tabula rasa terrain today, especially when a new build architecture is concerned, are we ever in a linear economy? Isn't it always a question of circular? Well, that's a big question, I know, and probably you don't need more questions at this stage, but excellent and timely topic.
Thank you. Those are really helpful resources. Thanks. Yeah, sure.
Maybe just a quick question, because you showed something about scale and boundaries. If you can elaborate a bit more, because you also mentioned planetary boundaries. There's a huge gap between a single building and the planetary boundaries. Even though circularity maybe is not possible locally, right? But you can only be really circular at the global scale. Maybe not. So yeah, can you just elaborate a bit on this?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the context of my research, specifically here, I will define this in terms of the climate targets of Switzerland for 2050 as sort of like the upper limit of what needs to be reached, and the lower limit being the definition of decent housing that I gave. And somewhere in this operating space, housing has to be provided for the people of Switzerland. So this is how I'm defining planetary boundary for just the sake of making things workable. More largely and perhaps more kind of a broader perspective on it. I read a lot about consumption corridors. So the understanding of if we were to build, I mean, it's kind of obvious, I guess, if we were to build in the way we build in Switzerland or in the Netherlands or in any of the countries here, all throughout the world, to actually provide housing for everyone, it would be an environmental disaster, right? So already with what we've constructed, there's such a huge impact on not just from the mining and use of resources, but in their operations, that doing this for the world over doesn't necessarily make sense. How to then think about housing when everybody, where it's like a fundamental right, but that doesn't have this resource issue, it can be understood from so many of the planetary boundaries. Like I've been working with the just and operating space that Stephen put forward, which focuses on biodiversity loss, on, well, I'm blanking right now, it has 3 parameters. But I don't think I can realistically or in a useful way measure those on a country or on a city level. So this is a little bit the difficulty in this. I guess that's what you're pointing to. There's an issue there. Yeah. Yeah.
Also, Thank you, Ankita. I just out of curiosity, what is the reason why most buildings are demolished in Geneva? Or like, how do they have to be registered with, is there certain criteria it has to meet, or, yes, do you have an answer to this?
It's a great question. So I was looking for what the demolition rate in Geneva is at all. And it was not something that I could easily find. So even to actually do this last, so I will do a material stock flow accounting, and even to do this demolition rate part, I'm not entirely sure yet where I'm going to get the data on it. I'm guessing that it is registered. I'm sure that there is some legal process with which your building has to be accepted to be demolished. I don't know what that number is yet. The choice of Geneva, which is maybe what your question was leading to. So then why am I looking at Geneva?
No, I get it, it's just as relevant as any other city, but I was just, really wondering about this, because I imagine your thesis will then inform that criteria and be a way, a method for deciding whether something can enter into be all the re's before it's demolished. But I think if we're not aware as to why they really are, or what is legitimate, what is no longer adequate housing for Geneva standards or context, then it's hard to determine.
So just as a clarification point, I think that the output of this won't be why a building should or shouldn't be demolished, but rather with the existing building stock, is it possible to provide adequate housing to everyone towards 2050? And that's also kind of coming from like some specificities of Geneva are that its buildings are mostly 50+ years old. It's a lot of it is rented, so it's not private. Well, it is privately owned, but it's not by the people who are living in it necessarily. And that there's also really this call that Geneva, as maybe some of you have also experienced, is having a housing crisis. So there's an extremely low vacancy rate in Geneva as well as Lausanne. I think it's like 0.01% or something, which is way lower than European averages of how many empty buildings there are in an urban agglomeration. And so my thinking is not so much should a building be demolished or not in Geneva, although I would also be curious, which is what my interviews will also be focused on, like why and when we keep using housing and who makes these decisions. But also the understanding of in the building stock as it exists today, what is enabling and what is driving and what is the barrier towards allowing that building stock to actually meet housing needs, not just today, but towards the future, when already there are so many calls for a housing crisis, meaning that we need to build more. Like this idea that building more will solve the housing crisis, my hypothesis is that this may not be environmentally the best way to go forward. So it's more to understand this part than, although I hope to also understand how the demolition works.
Last question.
Hi, thanks. Definitely a great presentation. I saw a question at the end, but then you switched slide, and I thought maybe I have something to say, but maybe not. I was thinking maybe as a key study again about it for your first question, in your experience, what are the factors? And I was thinking about cultural factors, because why at some point we believe a building should be demolished, and then why we believe it should not. And sometimes it's just a cultural look on it, because at some point we'll say, oh, it's too old, it's too ugly. And then we change, for example, aesthetic lens or resource lens, and we say, oh no, this is embedded energy, and so it's very valuable. So we've seen buildings like that change from how do you say, the déchets, from waste to actually embedded energy. And so it's just a cultural look at it. And I was thinking about architects like Vassal again, for the Tour Bois le Prêtre, where they actually, and for many projects, they were called and they said, no, we should actually keep the building. It has value and we should actually build upon it and not destroy it, because it has a lot of embedded qualities, which are energetic, but also memories, because people have been living in these buildings for years. And of course, they're too cold and maybe they have problems, but they also have qualities. So I was thinking that in my experience, what has shifted recently is really a cultural look rather than quantitative facts.